Mr. Barrett?
I'd like to nominate Chris Warkentin for chair.
It has been moved by Mr. Barrett that Mr. Warkentin be elected as chair of the committee. Y a-t-il d'autres motions?
Any other motions?
Pursuant to the House Order of Wednesday, is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion?
Yes. Yes.
Je déclare la motion.
The motion is adopted, and Mr. Walkington is now the chair of the committee. Mr. Walkington can take the chair.
Well, thank you, colleagues. It's a privilege. I'm hoping it is a privilege to be elected as a chair, and I'm hopeful that we can work together to get things done at this committee. I do want to thank David Sweet for his long-suffering efforts to keep us in line, and I will attempt to follow in his footsteps to be a fair chair and one that will allow for work to proceed at this committee. Now, in terms of this meeting, this is the 17th meeting of the Standing Committee on Access to Information Policy and Ethics, and I would suggest that we now move into an in-camera portion to allow us to move into committee business, so we can have a discussion about future meetings. If it's the will of the committee, I would suggest that we do that. What will be required in order to do that is for us to move into camera. So we'll have to actually log out of this and into a new meeting. I see that Mr. Angus has his hand raised. Do you have a suggestion or a thought on that, Charlie?
Yes. I didn't know it was necessary to go in camera. I think there's issues before us that should be discussed and deserve to be discussed in public. Particularly, I have sent a letter to my colleagues asking to bring forward as key witnesses so that we can move towards the completion of the WE study. That would include Craig and Mark Kielburger, Victor Lee, Sophia Marquez, Guy Spencer Elms, that we actually be willing to summons them if necessary. This is because of the allegations, partly that were raised in the very disturbing Bloomberg article, but we also need to wrap up this study, and I think we can do that fairly quickly, and I don't think that this needs to be done in camera. I'm ready to have that discussion now, because I think we need to reassure the Canadian people that we are here to get our job done. We have a report to finish, and these are key outstanding witnesses that we need to hear from.
Yes, you are correct, Mr. Angus. It is not required that committee business be moved in camera. There is one exception to that. There was documents that were circulated before this meeting that have to do with they are in camera documents, and so I would just caution members not to talk about those while we are in public. Second of all, there is some discussion about the Pornhub discussion that I think would be helpful to have in camera, just because of the sensitivity of that topic. But other than that, I think we can proceed out in public if that is the will of the committee. I see that Mr. Erkin Smith has his hand up.
Thanks very much, and I am looking forward to working together again on the ethics committee here. And while I haven't followed all that came before, I know that you have done a lot of work to this end, and to work constructively. I did go over Charlie's request, and I actually think it makes good sense to have a set of final meetings and to answer any outstanding questions. From just so I've got it right, Charlie's asking for the Craig and Mark Kielburger, Sophia Marquez, Victor Lee, and Spencer Elms. And certainly I think that if I'm just thinking through this and wonder what you think, Charlie. So Kielburger brothers for one meeting, Sophia Marquez, Victor Lee, Spencer Elms for another meeting, and certainly where summonses are required, I think I certainly would be, and I think we'd be amenable to supporting requests to ensure that witnesses attend before us.
I see Mr. Barrett, then we'll go back to Mr. Angus. Mr. Barrett?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry. Just make sure that I'm on there. So congratulations, Chair. Thanks for stepping in to fill that role. With respect to Mr. Angus's request, appreciate the effort at clarity so that we can close the study out and hear from key witnesses. And as you said, Mr. Angus, particularly in light of the revelations and the new information in the Bloomberg article. No argument per se to Mr. Erskine-Smith's proposed timetable. I'm not sure if there was one witness, if Mr. Angus had suggested that Mr. Bill Morneau be included in that list. So I'll leave that to Mr. Angus to answer. But with respect to the MindGeek Pornhub study, there's a discussion about potential witnesses, and at the request of potential witnesses and a request for privacy and for consideration about the sensitivity to their experience and their trauma, I would like to share with members of the committee some correspondence from representatives of some folks that we would like to put forward their names as witnesses. It's not something that can be discussed in public, but with respect to the pandemic spending and the We Matter, I think we can dispose of that in public.
You're very good, Mr. Angus.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Angus, there you are. Yeah.
I was so keen to get to work that I did not take a moment to congratulate you and say how much respect I have for you, and also to pay respect to David Sweet, who I thought did an extraordinarily professional job in some very trying times, and I think he kept that ship afloat when everybody was burning all ends of the boat. And so we assume that you will do the same. I think we can move on with this, and I certainly understand the necessity to go in camera on issues that are of a sensitive nature. So I support Mr. Barrett on that. So just what I think we could do here, I feel it's a fundamental obligation of our committee to be able to get a report to Parliament and the Canadian people on what we heard. We need to move on that. We are now coming into the spring of 2021. It's incumbent to I think move on with this report. So in terms of Mr. Erskine-Smith's offer on the table, I think a day with the Kielburger brothers would be very useful. I would say it has to be a 3-hour meeting. There's going to be many outstanding questions. Mr. Victor Lee, we've asked him since last summer to appear, and he hasn't appeared. He may be, feeling incapacitated, but we also, and Mr. Erskine-Smith will remember this, we had a hostile witness in the Cambridge Analytica study, Zach Massingham. He had doctor notes. He did not want to appear. We summoned him, and he appeared virtually, and we were able to finish the study. So I would say a second study, a second set of meetings, probably 3 hours, with Mr. Guy Spencer Elms, who's the key financial driver of the Kielburger operation in Kenya. Mr. Victor Lee, of course, is the architect of all the very convoluted finances, which I think would be helpful for us, because I don't think any of us actually have a real understanding of how their operation works, despite all the testimony we've gone through. Ms. Sophia Marquez, we've asked for before because of the issue of lobbying, so I would say that would be another meeting. Then we need to set aside time to get this report done so we can present it to the Canadian people. So that's my offer. And then I think if we have agreement on that, I would be more than willing to go in camera for the sensitive issues that we have to talk about in terms of documents, and certainly the issue of Pornhub. We want to make sure we do this right. So if we can get agreement on the first part, I would say, Mr. Warkentin, excellent chair that you're going to be, I'd be more than willing to go in camera.
Okay, I'm going to do, you made an offer, you didn't make a motion, but I suspect that if you needed to, you'd make that a motion. But I guess what I'd like to do is just get an indication from committee members. Is there anybody opposed to the offer? Are we, we may be forced to make that a motion, Mr. Angus, and then we can have a discussion and either vote it up or vote for it or vote against it, unless I see. But we'll only proceed that way if there isn't consent to move forward, because there seems to be consensus.
Chair?
Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, Chair. So all of those things, as outlined by Mr. Angus, I would like included in the meeting, as I said previously, that I would like an invitation and to hear a response from former Finance Minister Bill Morneau, and depending on the outcome of that outreach, for then the committee to make a decision on if a summons needs to be extended, or if he is available and attends of his own volition.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is go back to Mr. Angus just to get clarity in terms of how he would like to proceed, and then we're going to go through the speaking list. I have Ms. Shanahan, Gaudreau, and Mr. Erkin-Smith. So let's go back to Mr. Angus.
I think we have agreement on the first part of this. My understanding is that it seems that we have consensus. I'm sorry, I forgot to respond to Mr. Barrett on Mr. Morneau. I think Mr. Morneau is very important here. I'm of the feeling that maybe we should wait on the Ethics Commission's report, which I believe should be coming soon. We might be in a better position to have him come then. I leave that to my colleagues, but I certainly think that if there's a finding, then we'd be better equipped to have Mr. Morneau then. But I'm open. But I think if we have agreement on the first part, I'm ready to accept. And I would put that on the table. That I think with Mr. Morneau, I'd really like to hear. Well, I'd like to see what the ethics commissioner has to say, and I'm hoping that report will be coming soon.
Okay, Mr. Angus, these witnesses have all been invited. So are you suggesting that if they do not come, that I think Mr. Erkin-Smith had suggested a summons, is that the committee will, that's how we would proceed, provide another invitation? If they don't, then it's a summons. Very good. Yes. Okay, we're going to go through the speaking list now. I guess we will proceed on the basis that this is a motion if, in fact, we don't get just a consensus.
Why don't I just make
Mr.
a motion? Yeah. So why don't I just move that in order to? I just got badly written notes here, so I'm going to try. So if anyone's got an amendment, let me know. But so in order to complete the study into issues of conflict of interest in lobbying with respect to, I don't know how you guys phrased it originally, with respect to pandemics. So in order to complete the study into issues of conflict of interest in lobbying and report its findings to the House, the committee hold 2 final meetings to hear from the following witnesses. So Mark and Craig Kielburger for a 3-hour meeting, and then Sophia Marquez, Victor Lee, and Spencer Elms in another 3-hour meeting, and that the committee will summons these witnesses should they not respond and grant a request.
Very good. I appreciate that. Ms. Shanahan.
Well, thank you, Chair, for recognizing me, because I too would like to offer my congratulations on your election. And I think we are off to an auspicious start with the work that we have before us. I had my hand up originally really to speak to the public and in-camera part, and I think you have found a consensus on that, because of course the other topics that we want to discuss about the motion on Pornhub and other matters, we want to keep that in camera. And as for the matter that is before us, just as Mr. Angus and Mr. Erskine-Smith have outlined the motion that Nathaniel has outlined, I'm certainly in agreement to that. I'm agreeable to us proceeding on that basis.
Thank you. Ms. Gaudreau.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello, Mr. Chair. Congratulations. You have a big challenge ahead of yourself, but the good thing is that we've all met many times before. There are new members, of course, but congratulations to you, and I'm sure that everything will go very well for you. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Sweet. I think he's doing well. I hope he's doing well, rather. So I was saying yes without saying it out loud, of course, but we should absolutely be careful with confidential information. And I'm also very pleased to know that with all the time that we spent trying to unveil all sorts of information, I am very glad to see that we're going to carry on that way and finalize that work. So, of course, I'm for all of this, but we have to respect the timeline, meaning that once we have a report, then we'll need to come up with a witness list and to avoid missing any information and having to summon them once more or invite them once more. That's what I wanted to add. Welcome and happy 2021 to all of you, dear colleagues.
Well, thank you. I think that there's a consensus here in terms of how to proceed. I think that we've now, we do have a good witness list in terms of, and the instruction to the clerk, first of all, to invite, and then following, if those invitations aren't received well, to summons. So we will proceed on that basis. I will now suspend the public portion because I believe that the outstanding subjects should be discussed in camera, and I think that there's consent to do that and consensus to do that. So I will suspend. Colleagues, what you'll be required to do is to log out. There'll be a new link that will be distributed. You'll have to re-log into that new link for the in-camera portion. So colleagues, I'll suspend the meeting now. Meeting
Mr.
suspended.
Chair?
Oh, pardon me, Mr. Fergus. You weren't on my screen here. I apologize.
My apologies, Mr. Chair. Congratulations, of course, on your election. I just want to make sure that, or asking through you to the clerk, that is it the same code that she'd sent us before?
Let's just clarify that, Madam Clerk.
Nodding her head. Thank you.
I think that there is a new one that has been distributed. That is correct. Ms. Shanahan, or your hand is raised again. Would you like to? Okay. Do you have a question?
Yes, just to confirm that indeed the motion has passed as put forward.
The motion has passed as put forward. Okay. We'll proceed to the in-camera portion now, colleagues. We'll leave the meeting.
you